Back in the fall of 2017, after a bitter breakup, I found myself scrambling for a place to live. Hotels were burning a hole in my wallet, and every apartment I visited seemed worse than the last. Desperate, I finally lowered my standards and began considering shared apartments, a situation I'd hoped to avoid. That's how I found Florian. His ad seemed almost too good to be true. A spacious two-bedroom in Bushwick, modern furnishings, and the promise of total silence during the day. Florian, a night shift worker, only asked for one thing in return: no noise while he slept during daylight hours. The apartment was even more stunning in person, with its rustic warehouse vibes and impeccable cleanliness. Florian, a tall, thin Estonian man, had a dry, reserved demeanor that initially seemed a little odd. When I jokingly asked if he was a vampire, he deadpanned, "No, I'm a vegetarian." His seriousness was off-putting, but his rules were simple, and I was desperate. I paid 3 months' rent up front and moved in the following week. Living with Florian was eerily easy. He was so quiet it was like living alone. Our schedules rarely overlapped, and he maintained his promise of daytime silence. The kitchen was always spotless, and he seemed almost invisible, like a ghost. But as weeks went by, I noticed something odd. While the kitchen was always pristine, it would be fully stocked with vegetarian meal prep, seemingly overnight. It was unsettling, but not enough to raise alarm bells. For almost 2 months, life was peaceful. I poured myself into work, enjoyed the quiet, and began to feel like I'd lucked out. But that sense of comfort shattered one evening. One night, Florian called me. He apologized, explaining that his intended filming location had fallen through, and asked if he could use the apartment for a shoot. It would be a one-time thing, he assured me. All he asked was that I either stay in my room or leave the apartment for the evening. Curiosity piqued. I agreed to stay in my room, reasoning that I had noise-canceling headphones if things got loud. When Florian and his crew arrived, I greeted them briefly before retreating upstairs. His 2 colleagues, a quiet, artsy-looking pair, seemed just as reserved as Florian himself. Before I left, Florian warned me, "You may hear things that frighten or disturb you, but it's all simulated. Do not be alarmed." I spent the evening trying to focus on a video game, but it wasn't long before the first sounds reached me. A woman sobbing, her cries long and guttural. Knowing she was an actress, I brushed it off and switched my headphones to noise-canceling mode. But as the hours passed, the noises grew worse. Blood-curdling screams began cutting through my headphones, followed by frantic, desperate begging. "Please, no! God, no!" the woman wailed repeatedly. Despite knowing it was all acting, the primal terror in her voice sent chills down my spine. At one point, I removed my headphones to listen and instantly regretted it. The intensity of her screams was almost unbearable, as if she was truly fighting for her life. When I thought it couldn't get more bizarre, chanting began. "Hail Satan! Hail Satan!" they cried, their voices rising in a rhythmic, fevered ecstasy. It was unsettling to the core, and I stayed in my room until everything finally went quiet around 1 a.m. The next morning, I confronted Florian about the noises. He calmly explained it was all for ADR, audio dubbing for his film, and assured me no one was hurt. "If it disturbed you, it means the actress gave a good performance," he said matter-of-factly. I wanted to believe him, but something about his demeanor was off. Still, I let it go, resolving to move out if it happened again. 2 weeks later, Florian asked for another favor. He needed the apartment for another shoot. I agreed on the condition that I'd be warned well in advance. This time, I made plans to stay out all night. On the night of the shoot, I remembered I'd forgotten my laptop charger, essential for the evening I had planned. I texted Florian to let him know I'd be stopping by briefly. When he didn't respond, I decided to drop by anyway. As I entered the apartment, the sight before me made my blood run cold. Clear plastic sheeting covered the floors and walls, and strips of plastic hung like curtains between doorways. The space felt more like a crime scene than a film set. Before I could call out for Florian, two men in black suits and masks appeared, moving toward me with alarming speed. The masked men slammed me to the ground, knocking the wind out of me. One of them pulled out a stun gun, zapping my leg, leaving me paralyzed and disoriented. I tried to explain I lived there, but they ignored me, shouting, "Intruder!" A commanding voice from another room told them to remove me. The men dragged me outside and dumped me in the hallway before slamming the door shut. Shaken, I called the police, convinced something sinister was happening inside. But when officers arrived and opened the door, all the plastic sheeting was gone. Florian greeted them with a calm, articulate explanation, claiming the men were hired security for an exclusive party. The police believed him, and I was left feeling humiliated and more terrified than ever. After the cops left, Florian's demeanor changed entirely. Gone was the polite, apologetic man. In his place was someone cold and threatening. He told me I was lucky nothing worse had happened and demanded I move out immediately. I didn't argue. Within days, I found a new place and left the apartment for good. To this day, I don't know what Florian and his crew were really doing in that apartment. Were they filming? Conducting some sort of ritual? Something darker? I don't want to know. But I'll never forget those screams, the chilling plastic sheeting, and the cold, calculating look in Florian's eyes as he warned me to leave. Story 2. The Crackhead Roommate. Back when my friend Dean moved to Bournemouth to be closer to his girlfriend, we all thought he was living the dream. He'd found a job, a cheap shared apartment, and was settling into his new life. But as it turned out, his dream quickly became a nightmare. Dean moved into a shared flat in a quiet neighborhood. His flatmate Aaron seemed friendly at first, a metalhead who liked the same movies and music as Dean. They'd have a beer together and hang out, but as Dean got to know Aaron better, the cracks started to show. Aaron was a heavy drinker, often plastered by noon. He didn't have a job, but vaguely hinted at freelancing, which turned out to be a mix of shoplifting, burglary, and stealing from drunk people on nights out. The worst part? Aaron was unpredictable. One minute, he'd be laughing at a joke. The next, he'd be screaming and smashing things. His temper was explosive, and Dean quickly realized he'd made a huge mistake. One night, Dean came home to find Aaron blaring music in his room, high out of his mind on synthetic cannabis. Then Aaron burst into the living room, wielding a samurai sword. He started swinging it around, pretending to train like some kind of warrior. Terrified, Dean locked himself in his bedroom, praying Aaron wouldn't come after him. That night was a wake-up call. Dean needed to get out, but with no savings and a 6-month lease, he was trapped. 2 weeks later, Dean invited me and another mutual friend to visit for the weekend. When we arrived, we were shocked. Dean looked gaunt and sleep-deprived, and the flat was a disaster. Dirty dishes, trash everywhere, and a suffocating stench of alcohol and sweat. He confessed that Aaron's behavior had gone from bad to worse. Not only was he violent, but he'd also started trying to climb into Dean's bed at night, making crude jokes about sharing warmth. Dean had resorted to locking his door every night. The real reason Dean had invited us down wasn't for a friendly visit. It was for backup. He planned to move out, but he needed our help to do it without Aaron noticing. While we were talking, the door slammed open. Aaron walked in, and instantly, the mood shifted. Dean shrank into himself, and we saw a glimpse of how terrified he was of this man. Aaron was tall and wiry, with shoulder-length black hair and tattoos covering his arms. He had a nose ring and a menacing glare that could cut through steel. Surprisingly, he was polite at first, even suggesting we throw a party that night. Dean played along, but once Aaron left to pick up supplies, he told us the plan. If Aaron blew all his money on drugs and booze that night, he'd be forced to go out stealing the next day, giving us the window we needed to move Dean out. That night, Aaron returned with his girlfriend and a bag full of drugs. His girlfriend was quiet and timid, clearly used to his erratic behavior. The party started harmlessly enough, but as Aaron drank more and did line after line of cocaine, his mood grew darker. He began berating us for being boring and pressured Dean into doing a line, which he reluctantly did to keep the peace. But it was when Aaron started playing deafening industrial metal and trying to force us to sing along that things took a sinister turn. At one point, Aaron pulled his girlfriend into the middle of the room to dance. What started as awkward swaying quickly turned rough. He began grabbing her neck, choking her while laughing maniacally. We were ready to intervene, but before we could, she elbowed him in the stomach and slapped him across the face. That's when Aaron snapped. He lunged at her, throwing punches as she screamed for him to stop. Dean didn't hesitate. He tackled Aaron to the ground, and we jumped in to help hold him down. We shouted for Aaron's girlfriend to call the police, but instead, she ran into Aaron's room and locked the door, leaving us to deal with him. Aaron thrashed and screamed, threatening to kill us as we struggled to keep him restrained. I managed to grab my phone and call 999, begging them to send help before he broke free. When the police arrived, Aaron didn't go quietly. He spat at them, screamed obscenities, and even tried to bite one of the officers. They eventually dragged him out, handcuffed and kicking, while we sat there, exhausted and shaken. With Aaron gone for the night, we wasted no time packing up Dean's belongings and moving him into his girlfriend's mom's garage. It wasn't ideal, but it was safe. As we drove back home the next day, we couldn't stop talking about the surreal nightmare Dean had endured. But one thing haunted us most: Aaron's girlfriend. Even after being choked and hit, she had run back to Aaron's room instead of escaping or calling for help. It was clear she was deeply trapped in his web of control and manipulation. We hoped she would find a way out, but as of now, none of us know what happened to her. Dean got out, but the experience left scars. To this day, he jokes about being a roommate survivor, but we all know the truth. It's no laughing matter when someone's life is on the line. Story 3. The farm incident. When I was younger, I made a series of bad decisions that landed me in serious trouble. After getting caught up in drugs and arrested, I was given two choices: jail or a state-mandated rehab program called The Farm. It wasn't what I expected. A real working farm with livestock and crops, run by a man who seemed to know people in high places. In exchange for cheap labor, the program gave us troubled youths a shot at redemption. Looking back, the farm saved my life. It gave me discipline and purpose. And by the time I reached 9 months in, I had worked my way up to being a mentor. That meant I had my own living quarters and was responsible for guiding new arrivals through the program. It was an honor, but it also came with challenges, and one of those challenges nearly cost me my life. Shauna, my mentee, arrived angry and defensive. She didn't want to be there, but that was typical for new arrivals. I kept my cool and focused on showing her the ropes. Over the first few weeks, she softened. Working with the livestock seemed to ground her, and while her attitude still flared up occasionally, we were making real progress. Then, out of nowhere, the cops showed up. 2 officers came to the farm, looking for Shauna. The group leader pulled me aside, explaining that Shauna had a warrant out for her arrest in another county. They were there to take her into custody. My heart sank. I knew how much this program meant to her, how much progress she'd made. I asked if I could break the news to her first, hoping it might go over better coming from me. The group leader agreed, and I made my way to the dorms. Shauna was lounging on her bed when I walked in. I sat down and told her we needed to talk. Her face dropped the moment I mentioned the cops. When I told her about the warrant, she started to panic, asking what it was for. She swore she had no idea, which made me think it might be something minor, a missed court date or a traffic violation. I assured her it was better to face it head-on than to run. At first, she seemed to listen, but as we walked toward the group hub where the cops were waiting, I noticed she was lagging behind. I turned to encourage her forward, but before I could react, she grabbed me from behind. The next thing I felt was cold steel against my throat. I froze, too stunned to process what was happening. "Keep walking!" she hissed, pressing the blade closer. The cops immediately drew their weapons, shouting for her to drop the knife. My heart was pounding out of my chest, but all I could think about was getting Shauna to let me go before things escalated. "Shauna, what are you doing?" I whispered. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," she snapped. "I'm not going back to jail." I tried to reason with her as we shuffled backward. I told her the cops would kill her if she didn't stop. "They're going to shoot you, Shauna. Please, just let me go." She ignored me, yelling at the officers to stay back. The whole time I could feel the blade trembling against my skin. Then out of nowhere, she said something that chilled me to my core. "They'll be too busy saving you to chase me." For the first time, I realized she might actually go through with it. I started to panic, begging her to stop. But as she raised the knife, she screamed, "I'm sorry." The gunshot was deafening. Blood splattered across my face, and I fell to my knees, clutching my neck, convinced I'd been hit. But the blood wasn't mine. It was Shauna's. She crumpled to the ground, the knife falling from her hand. The cop's aim had been precise, hitting her between the nose and eye. She was gone instantly. I collapsed beside her, shaking and screaming. The officers rushed over, pulling me away as I tried in vain to wake her. For days, I couldn't process what had happened. I replayed it over and over in my head, wondering if I could have said or done something differently. The cut on my neck was minor, barely a scratch, but the emotional wound was deep. Shauna's last words haunted me, her apology, her desperation. I knew she wasn't a bad person, just a scared kid who had made a terrible choice. The farm counselors tried to reassure me, saying there was nothing I could have done. But even now, years later, I can't help but wonder, if I'd just said the right thing, could I have saved her? Could you have talked Shauna down? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.